It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Gerd Korman, Professor Emeritus at Cornell University. Not only are you a Holocaust survivor, but you became a pioneer and one of the forerunners of establishing the study of Holocaust in American academia. And Gerd, your family history about the Shoah encapsulates, I think, so many facets of the Shoah, of our Jewish history. It's just the most amazing story, what happened to your family and how you survived, and all the different aspects of the Shoah are included in your story, which is just phenomenal. So if you could tell us a little bit about your family, how they got to Germany, the origins on your father's side and your mother's side, and then a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm not sure how much I actually remember or know as a historian, but on my father's side, they came from a little town called Narol in Galicia. Narol is essentially a suburb of Lemberg, and they were Belzer Hasidim. Big family. I got to know a few of them. A brother of my father and some other relatives. I met some of my relatives when we were deported to Spongin. Partly, I think, because they came to visit us. I think. Because it was just before the war. But my father's relatives kept an eye on us somehow once we were deported to Spongin in Poland. And we remained in Spongin until we left for England and the United States. My father had much the worst of it, because my father originally left the three of us in Spongin, going back to Germany, hoping to get to the United States.
But can I just ask you, can we go back to the origins?
Yes.
Your mother's family, where did she come? They come from?
My mother's family, my immediate family, when I first got to meet them, lived in Germany, in Wuppertal, which is a town near Cologne. That family had migrated from Galicia some decades before. And that family had 3 children, my mother and her 2 brothers. One of those brothers, the older one, was Oswald Laufer. And Oswald Laufer early on became a Reichsbanner, a social democrat that had a militant wing. And he was the one who actively fought National Socialists in the streets of his town, Wuppertal.
We have a picture of Oswald, and I think he was killed.
He was murdered, right. He was murdered by a gang of 5 Nazis who shot him in front of his parents' household. Right. And Oswald's memory is treasured in Wuppertal itself by a number of people who have annual memorials in his name and have kept his memory alive.
I think you were in 1998. We have a picture of you with your brother Manfred.
Yes.
With a plaque where the city put up a plaque in his memory.
Right.
And when were you born?
I was born in Hamburg. No.
Your Manfred was born in Hamburg.
No, I was born in Wuppertal, in the Rhineland, because that's where my mother's family came from. They had migrated from Galicia and had come to settle in Wuppertal, or Elberfeld as it was called.
And you were born back in July the 24th, 1928.
Yeah, right.
It's incredible.
Wuppertal was also, I think I have this right, the birthplace of Goebbels.
And I think Engels was...
The infamous Goebbels. Mm-hmm. I think he came out of Wuppertal also. Wuppertal is a famous textile town for a number of years. And we visited Wuppertal quite often.
I think you mentioned in your book Marx and Engels also had a connection to the town. Karl Marx and Engels.
Yes, well, that's because there was a very strong socialist element in the Wuppertal area, but that came also to mean there was a very strong Nazi element in Wuppertal.
And then your family moved to Hamburg?
My parents met, so the story goes, my parents met on a Hanover railway station and were married in Wuppertal, which then was known just as Elberfeld. I'm blocking on the rabbi who married them, but he became quite famous in reform circles, German reform circles, German Jewish reform circles. And they moved to Hamburg early in their married life, where he was the traveling salesman. Also a Zionist. Not a labor Zionist, it was a middle-class Zionist. And we lived there until the deportation.
And your brother Manfred was born 3.5 years later?
After me, yes.
And what are your earliest recollections of Hamburg, or what is your earliest recollections of growing up?
My
earliest recollections.
Oh, the earliest recollection. Well, I've long had the sense that with the deportation in 1938, I lost a good deal of my memory. The trauma of that deportation experience cost me a lot of my memory. Bits and pieces of came back, but most of it, I think, was gone. So what I do remember are little bits and pieces here and there. So one of the experiences that was dearest to me is that I became a young kid who loved to play soccer. And I guess one of the reasons I loved to play soccer is because I became pretty good at it. But I also had a marvelous experience in the Jewish parochial school in Hamburg. that came under the direction of a gentleman whose last name was Spear, and under the general direction of Rabbi Karlebach, who was one of Hamburg's great rabbis, and who is remembered in many circles as having gone with his congregation and to his death when the Nazis deported his family and with others out of Hamburg and into Eastern Europe, right? I got to know Rabbi Karlebach as a kid because I sang in the choir of the Orthodox synagogue of Hamburg, where he was chief rabbi. And so in one way or another, I had some contact with Rabbi Karlebach, which to him, I'm sure, wasn't of any consequence, but which to me as a young boy was very much of consequence. I sang in the choir of the Bornplatz synagogue, and I think I mentioned it in Nightmare's Fairy Tale. I think so. But I remember the experience of being in that choir, because I was among the youngest with the high soprano. But I also was the kid who invariably got into mischief.
So, Prof, you remember singing in the choir?
Oh yes, oh yes. I also remember getting into trouble in the choir. Trouble instigated by the older boys. And finally, I think they got rid of me because I was part of a group with the choir who got into trouble and mischief. Right. Right.
And your school? Do you remember? You had fond memories of your school?
Right. In the few years before we were deported, I attended the Talmud Torah Schule of Hamburg, which had quite a reputation and maintained its reputation after the war. It was the synagogue that was connected with Karlebach's synagogue, but it was a modern German Orthodox shul and school, both. As I remember, as a kid, very demanding school, but I managed to survive. So I was still going to that school when we were deported.
And did you have mainly Jewish friends, or did you have any non-Jewish friends?
Oh no, all my friends were Jewish. I think, as I wrote in Nightmare's Fairy Tale, we lived in one part of Hamburg before the Nazi period really struck. And then my parents were forced to move into the Jewish parts of Hamburg that developed around the Karlebach synagogue. I don't know anything about, through personal experience, of the period before we moved into the more Jewish quarter. Because when I was born, first in Wuppertal, and then brought to Hamburg by my parents. We lived away from where the main synagogue was. And then under the Nazi regime, we became part of the population that was increasingly concentrated in an inner part of Hamburg, not far from that school we were talking about before.
And Gerd, do you remember when Hitler came to power and the Nazi youth, or do you remember Nazi?
I remember, but the way I remember, but the way I remember it is really as a youngster with his childhood interests and friends, which is to say, I was very conscious of the arrival of the Hitler regime, partly because my mother's brother was murdered as a Reichsbanner. So that was an event in 1933. So from the very beginning, in my particular family, the arrival of Nazis to power came with his murder. As a child, under those circumstances, I was aware of his murder, largely because my mother took me to the gravesite of Oswald in Wuppertal. But we were living in Hamburg. She went back to visit her parents periodically. My memory of life as a young Jewish kid in Hamburg was such a mixture of experiences. On the one hand, I remember riding the subway from a section of Hamburg that was some distance away from where the Talmud Torah Schule was, which meant I took the subway to go to school.
And you did it by yourself?
Yeah, like many kids. But it also meant I usually was carrying Jewish books. And I don't remember much in detail about the subway rides, except one day, out of the clear blue, I found myself in the lap of a Nazi official, maybe an SS official, I don't know, he was in uniform. It was a crowded subway. He put me on his lap, and that was the closest I ever got to a Nazi official.
And you were carrying your books, which were in Hebrew?
Oh, it was all there. It was all there. But nobody hurt me, nobody touched me. I mean, we were fellow passengers. So, in those years, which must have been 36, 37, there was still a lot of coexistence, which, individual Nazi officials tolerated or ordinary Nazi officials tolerated. I was aware of having become part of the Jewish population that was forced to resettle in a particular part of Hamburg. Ghetto-like, but not really a ghetto. And I recall quite vividly, as I think I write about in the book, traveling with my parents from Hamburg to Lübeck and seeing in Lübeck all kinds of Nazi paraphernalia and photographs and paintings or whatever. In other words, it was a trip right through the early months of Nazi Germany.
Did you ever experience any anti-Semitism that you can recall?
No, the only anti-Semitism I directly experienced was seeing signs out on the sidewalks where I walked in Lübeck about no Jews being allowed and things of that sort. My uncle's murder hovered over our family from the moment it happened.
So we have a lovely...
He came to visit us, my uncle did, in Hamburg, before he was murdered.
So good, we have a wonderful picture in 1934 or 35 with you and your mother and Manfred in Hamburg. And then you also went to the beach. Do you remember taking the train going to the beach?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, because the beach wasn't segregated yet, so far as I remember. I mean, it's quite possible it was segregated, and I just wasn't aware of it.
And you and Manfred, you had a special bond?
Pardon?
You and your brother, you had a special connection, a special bond? You were very close with your brother, with Manfred?
Yes. Well, the deportation was traumatic. And in my memory, the deportation changed everything.
So that was on a Friday, October the 28th, 1938. Right. What do you recall about that deportation? It must have been such a trauma to be...
Yeah, it was. And I think I captured it quite well in the book, because it was such a dramatic event and so sudden. So from the moment a local police officer, actually a local policeman, arrested us, I entered a different world, namely a prisoner. I became a prisoner of the Nazi regime as a child. And I was quite conscious of it. And what I became so conscious of, and what remains with me, has remained with me a long, long time, is the awareness that my father had lost complete control over me as a child. Because I don't quite know why I became so conscious of it, but I did. Every step he took, and my mother took, were by Nazi command, either up there or somewhere middle range or whatever. But I became very aware as a child that my parents had lost complete control over me. I was all of 7 years old. And I tried to capture this moment in Nightmare's fairy tale where the train had already arrived from Hamburg through Essen and in Spongin. The arrival in Spongin was very dramatic because the train stopped in the German part of the border country. And it was there that the full impact of our condition really hit me as a child, because the train had stopped and we, as captured Jewish prisoners and train riders, were suddenly taken off the train, and our fathers disappeared. They didn't disappear very far because we were all lined up on a railway station, and the officials who ran this show called out the names of the people whose passports they had or whatever. And so I saw, and my brother saw, my father, having been called by name, having to walk this, what I thought was a long railway platform, and then came back with his papers. I remembered from that point on that somehow I knew he had lost complete control over me. In retrospect, I often thought about this moment, but I really think it's an honest and correct reconstruction that here is this 10-year-old boy who at some level understands completely that his father had lost absolute control over him. Because I was on the platform with my mother and brother, and some Nazi official toward the far end of the platform was calling out his name, like they had called out other names. And so he had to walk a portion of that platform to those officials. And if you're in my position as a 10-year-old, you're not quite sure where he's going until you realize that he was coming back. And he was coming back with his passport papers. Because now, just before the border crossing, the physical border crossing, the Nazi guards in army gave us back our papers, so that when we went into a no man's land, we had our papers. But that's where they pushed us from the train station platform that was in the German town of Neubenchen towards the land border between Germany and Poland. On the one side, the western side, was this little town of Neubenchen. As I learned soon enough, on the Polish side was a town called Spongin. So the Nazis now organized us in such a way that we would march quickly from German territory into no man's land territory, in which German soldiers and troops suddenly appeared in very organized fashion. Up to that point, soldiers had walked with us as we were deported from the German town of Neubenchen, walked towards the physical land border with Poland. And it was, I try to write about this actually, and it was at this point that these German soldiers who had been walking alongside of us, I think we walked about 3 kilometers, suddenly deployed. I mean, that's a term I learned to use afterwards. But suddenly they deployed in disciplined army fashion, whereas before they were just sort of armed stragglers who were walking along with us. Now suddenly they turned into a German soldier, police soldier formation. So they were on the right and on the left of this group of Jews, and then they formed a kind of chain behind us. And that's how we entered no man's land, because these land borders have a section that's technically and legally considered no man's land. No man's land meaning the Germans don't control it and the Poles don't control it. They have an agreement that neither control it. So we were very conscious of the fact that we were entering this no man's land, which meant we had no police or soldier protection from whatever side. And I was very conscious of it, because I didn't know who was in front of us initially, but I certainly knew who was behind us, because the Germans had deployed in a real special formation so that they could have a right flank and a left flank and a human chain behind us.
And do you remember the bayonets?
Yes, I certainly do. I do. Because my father, who had been a soldier in the Polish army, as best as I could remember now, can remember now and had remembered before, and you have to realize I talk about a memory that I've talked about a memory before, that it's possible there's a garbled version in all of this. But I think I still have it pretty straight. Namely, that the German military, or policed military, deployed. And they deployed in such a way that they formed a chain behind this group of deported Jews that they were pushing forward. They didn't know, but suspected what would face them in Polish territory, and the Germans no doubt had figured this all out, knew exactly that there were only 3 Polish soldiers guarding this particular spot. So now you have a well-armed German military force pushing thousands of Jews across a land border which was faced by 3 Polish soldiers. Someone knew really what they had planned and what they were doing.
And you were deported because your father was Polish?
we were deported because my father was identified as a Pole with a Polish citizenship and deported because by that time the Nazi regime had made a decision that those Jews who were identified as Polish Jews no longer had the protection of the German state. That what we've been talking about are unarmed civilians ranging in age from, let's say where I am now, to children who are still nursing and were still carrying their luggage and had absolutely no idea what was happening, what was waiting for them. And we were in this, somehow we knew, or someone told us, we were in no man's land. Most people have never heard of no man's land. But no man's land was the name that I associated, term that I associated with land over which neither Germany nor Poland claimed jurisdiction. So it sat between these two national borders, and the German government with its military force had pushed us with fixed bayonets into this territory, which was no man's territory. They had no business there, but they pushed us into it anyway, right? And they, at this frontier, they faced 3 Polish soldiers. So you have to imagine a well-armed, highly disciplined German military unit pushing thousands of people into the face of 3 armed Polish soldiers. What I remember about that particular moment was just the motion and the awareness that we were in territory that was very scary, and suddenly hearing a shot. At which point, everybody among the Jews hit the ground. Perhaps because of what my father said to his family, others said to their family, quick, lie down. They suddenly remembered all their training in the Polish army during World War I. So, we take our suitcases and put them in front of our faces. And my father, I don't know, I guess he had sufficient sense where he was, managed to have his family hang back because he didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. So we were close to the Germans and their open bayonets. And there was the shot. We hear the shot, and everybody just falls flat, putting their suitcases up in front of their faces. And then there's silence, as I remember. Silence. Which was followed by what seems like, in retrospect, a human tidal wave. It suddenly, as people got to their feet in response to I don't know what, I think either at the time I saw it or immediately thereafter people were talking about it. A couple of Jews in the front lines of that deported element got up after they heard the shot and overran the 3 Polish soldiers. They had no choice but to let us run across the border, because 3 armed Polish soldiers are not going to stop thousands of people backed up by high-powered military forces of the German government. So, with that, the Germans had achieved their goal, namely, they had pushed us into no man's land, controlled us in no man's land, which they had no authority to do, and then engineered a situation where we ran from one part of no man's land that the Germans were supposed to respect but didn't, into the Polish part of the no man's land, which they couldn't control, to patches of grass where we could collapse, having decided we had run across the border. And at that point, as I recall, most people gave into a sense of complete collapse. Complete collapse. They realized the Poles were not going to kill them, even though they fired some shots, maybe they were blanks in the air. And the Germans had let go of us. So we were nowhere and everywhere. And then suddenly, a couple of people in front, very courageous, in the face of 3 Polish soldiers, they got up and overran the 3 Polish soldiers. And with that, everybody ran and collapsed. And we were running with our luggage. And mothers and fathers were running with their little ones. And we just collapsed on Polish soil. Didn't take very long before people like my father recognized that local Poles, whom they knew, didn't like Jews either, were coming towards us with horse and wagon. And as I recall, I remember hearing my father say, "Don't give them anything." And sure enough, they were coming to collect the luggage and to keep it. And he was instructing us to somehow hold on to, because we didn't know whether they were armed or unarmed. I mean, the child had absolutely no idea, but for that matter, neither did the adults. had no idea who was controlling whom. And I think for a few moments after the border crossing, no one controlled anything. We were on Polish territory, and soon enough, Poles came to take our luggage, ostensibly to help us. But many came to steal our luggage. So my father, in his great wisdom and knowledge of Polish anti-Jewish behavior, worked very hard that we hang on, don't give them anything, hold on to your luggage, hold on to everything. So we did, and we held on to it. In any event, from that point forward, other actors came into play. The Germans had done their work, right? The Polish defense soldiers had done their work. So now it was the question of who would come for us or towards us. Nobody really knew. And in that really quite complex competing authorities, which meant no authority for a moment, people somehow managed to hold together somehow. And the first thing that I remember of some kind of organized response to our physical deportation was the arrival of horses in our direction. And I learned soon enough that those horses coming into our direction had been released from their stables so that we could get into them as the new residents. We took the horses out and put us Jews in. And that transition opened up a whole new chapter for us, because it meant that we were under Polish jurisdiction, and the Poles were quite happy to let Polish Jewish organizations come in and help them as much as they could. So on the other side of the Polish border, Jewish organizations participated with Polish organizations to somehow deal with this little mass of humanity.
We have a picture in your book where you show just people arriving and totally lost.
In Spongin.
In Spongin, yeah.
That you have to drink.
Yeah,
You have to
there's
drink.
another.
Is that juice or ginger?
It's water. Do you want some juice?
No, what is that?
It's water.
That's water?
And you remember being in the stables? You remember?
Oh, yes, for
That's where they
sure.
lived.
Oh, for sure. Not so much the stable, as I remember having seen the horses come out, and then being with my parents, somehow in control over part of a big straw sack, or the whole straw sack, I can't remember now which. But certainly we had part of a straw sack where our little family unit settled in with others who had been pushed across the border. And that lasted for quite a number of hours. And in that period of time, Jewish refugee organizations had arrived. And I remember hearing them give talks in Yiddish and stuff, which of course I didn't really understand. But I learned afterwards that the Joint Distribution Committee and others out of Warsaw immediately sent their people into Spongin to somehow cope with this impossible situation. Because we were in a stable, a huge stable. And I guess after a while there were mattresses that appeared. I don't know if they were the mattresses on which the horses lived or some other creatures. I don't know. I didn't know then. I never bothered to find out. But I think I'm right in saying that Jewish Polish organizations moved to heaven and earth to try to help us.
And they provided food and...
Tried everything.
And good, I just want to mention, amongst the deportees that were sent was the, and I think your family knew, they knew the Gispan family. Gispan. The Gispan family.
They dispensed?
The Gispan family. Where they were also deported, and their son Herschel, that's a whole story about Herschel, who was in Paris and he heard about his parents being deported. And he shot the German diplomat.
No, that's right. My parents...
They knew the family.
We had relatives who were on the deportation trains from Essen. And as I recall now, the parents of the young man who was murdered in Paris also came from there.
Greenspan.
It was Herschel. Their son Herschel was in Paris, and he shot the diplomat, and that was... the Germans used that as a precursor for Kristallnacht.
That's what they said, right.
He shot Ernst van Roth.
But for us, the encounter with that family was had nothing to do with anything like that.
But your family knew? They knew the family?
That was all in the future.
Daddy, did your family know the Greenspan family?
I don't know. I don't think so.
But they were part of the deportees that were with your family.
Right. I mean, we got to know who that was soon enough, but in the immediate moment, I don't remember. We have relatives who came in, who was in this deportation. They had been shipped in from Essen, and as I remember now, that family you were talking about had come on that train from Essen too. I think. If it really matters, you have to double check.
It's just amazing the link in Jewish history, what happened. It's just...
Right.
And when did you go to the mill?
To the?
The mill.
The mill.
The mill. Ah. I don't have the chronology straight in my head, but maybe I never did. But I think it took the Jewish agencies that were active, like the Joint Distribution Committee, who they were forced to deal with an impossible situation. because this was in the experiences of those Jewish organizations in Poland, most of the time at first, in the committee organization, of having to deal with thousands of refugees suddenly planted at their door. But they somehow managed by themselves, for all I knew, without the aid of the Polish government, but with the permission of the Polish government. Very important to remember, with the permission of the Polish government. They set up a whole supply and distribution system so that we had something to eat, we had something with which to cover our bodies, and with which to stay up the first night, being afraid to go to sleep.
Oh, sorry.
So those were the conditions initially that introduced us to straw sacks, which by the kind act of horses that had been there before but had been let out were now available for us without anybody changing any sheets or anything of that sort. We had their beds, and we lived with their beds for quite a while. Quite a while, meaning, I think, at least 3 days and nights. At least. Yeah.
And do you remember going to the mall?
Pardon?
Do you remember going to the mall?
The hall?
The mall.
The mill?
Yeah.
Well, that was a very different experience, because we went from the stable to different kinds of housing arrangements. My father became part of a group of deportees who worked very hard to get us some accommodations to the circumstances we were at. So I guess it must have been the committee's work that were able to get an abandoned flour mill, or they worked out a way to have a flour mill abandoned for us in any event. We were then forced to move into this flour mill. But my father, I think along with some other family members, not ours, but in general, figured out how to stay out of the mill, because he never came into the mill. He was always outside the mill. And that allowed him to make arrangements to get us out of the mill into some quarters in Spongin.
I'm going to just show a picture of your father at this time. It's amazing that you have these pictures. It's quite incredible that the pictures of your mother and your father,
Right.
that you have them. And this is a picture of your mother.
Just a minute.
1938-39. Good. It's quite incredible that these photographs of you, both your mother and your father at this time, that these photos survived. That first of all that they were taken and that they survived. It's quite incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think when you were in the flour mill, that's when you started your love for Zionism. You started learning more about Palestine and Zionism, about Zionism, about the land of Israel, about Palestine. You became more Zionistic.
No. My father was a Zionist. But my mother didn't want to go to Palestine because her parents lived in Germany. And, you know, one of the most untold experiences of people like us, and in conditions much worse than we were in, we were, we were totally unprepared for these kinds of experiences. I think my father relied on his Austro-Hungarian army experience, how to react to emergencies. Because I remember him giving commands as if he knew what he was doing, but he didn't know what he was doing. We went into the flour mill without my father. And that was a strategic choice he made, or both my mother and father made. And I have no idea where they got the smarts from to do it. But the fact was that he was not in the flour mill, which left him free to make other arrangements for us. It must have taken him quite a while to get those arrangements in place, because we stayed in that flour, the rest of us stayed in that flour mill for a long time, relatively speaking. So he was trying to find housing for us outside the flour mill, in the town of Spongin, or right near it, with other families. And we stayed in this flour mill, which must have been quite an experience, because people like my mother, and perhaps some men too, I don't know, but people like my mother became part of the crew in the flour mill that did the cooking and the feeding of the people in the flour mill. So by virtue of having that kind of role, she was able to feed us, perhaps a little bit more than we might have had otherwise. In retrospect, their conduct, my parents' conduct, absolutely striking. because he stayed out of the mill in order to be able to help us get out of there. And she went into the mill to make sure that her children were being fed and taken care of, which she couldn't always do. Quite courageous on their part. My father never came into the flour mill, always stayed out. I don't really remember much detail of life in that flour mill. I must have suppressed it. Any kind of memory really never came back. I think I chose very hard to forget it.
And I think at this time you met Yossel.
Pardon?
At this time you met a little boy Yossel who was your brother's age. I think at this time his father unfortunately had died and...
Right. Yossel came out of his own hell. His father had died in the process of being deported in the early settlement in Spongin. And he belonged to an ultra-Orthodox Jewish family. Not like my family. Very, very different. His had been ultra-Orthodox. And I tried to capture his life, because nobody else has. And also because it was so symbolic of the lives of so many people. He had two sisters and a mother. Father had died.
He had an asthma attack.
Hmm?
He had an asthma attack. He had an asthma attack.
He had what?
An asthma attack.
He had asthma.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what little I knew about Joseph, I wrote about. Partly because having known Joseph at that particular moment was so memorable. This was that kid, my brother's age, who somehow was working in the food deliveries mechanism. So I got to know this character, who was no older than my brother, 3.5 years younger than me. He's the kid who's throwing bread to a large number of people outside the smallish room where bread was being produced to where it had been sent. There he was, this little youngster, my brother's age, my brother's size. He's throwing loaves of bread to people like me and older people. And that's how we were being fed in Spongin. A kid throwing loaves of bread. That was my first encounter with Joseph. In my mind, he was a very colorful young kid who was doing this great work. I mean, he was throwing us bread. And then I don't remember much about anything about Joseph until it turned out we were together on the Warszawa, the Polish ship that took us from Gdynia in Poland to England.
Okay, so I just want to backtrack a little bit. From your incredible book, Nightmare's Fairy Tale, which I must admit it's one of the most amazing books on the Shoah that I've ever read. But you just, it's amazing how you capture the time and the place and what your parents did. Your father decided to try and go back to Hamburg to get the documents and to sort things out.
Right.
And he went back and you were left with your mother and your brother. And I think all this time, if I'm not mistaken, from the middle 30s, your parents tried to get visas to go to America.
I have no idea where their courage came from. Absolutely none.
So it was amazing to go back to Hamburg to try and retrieve.
Yeah, right. But here you have two people, parents, a sister of an Oswald Laufer who was murdered, whose parents were still in Germany. And you have a father whose parents are in Galicia, Narol near Lemberg. And they are making a series of decisions that's really mind-blowing. They have to decide whether or not to separate, whether this father, this head of household, should even consider leaving the family in the not so reasonable hope that he could get out of Spongin, get out of Europe, and somehow yet bring us to him. I mean, in retrospect, it's faith in the absurd.
It's incredible.
It's faith in the absurd. It really is. And yet they did it. So he goes back to Germany as part of a program to undo the damage that the Nazis did in our deportation. So he does what he has to do. And as I write in this book, while he's there, if his friend in Cuba manages to send him visa papers so he can come from Hamburg to Cuba instead of going back to Spongin, because that was the choice that was facing him.
And his friend Christian Gisler helped him
Yes.
with the Hamburg America line.
Yes. I think that's a very important part of our experience. Namely, as someone in the book title said, the kindness of strangers, and maybe the kindness of neighbors.
Because he also helped your mother. This Christian Gisler, he also helped your mother later on.
Yeah. We had the neighbors in my first part of Hamburg where we lived, who was employed by the Hapag Steamship Company. And from the get-go, from the start, this man and his family became part of the people who helped us get out of this whole mess. And he did it by virtue of his position with the Hapag Steamship Company. And we had been neighbors in part of Hamburg before we were part of this concentration of Jews in the Jewish part of Hamburg. And Geisler's never forgot who their Korman friends were. Never. So it was Geisler who must have, because I don't know any other source it could have come from, who must have been personally responsible for all the good things that happened to my father. I mean, he got a place on the St. Louis. Forget about the fact that the St. Louis ended up in hell, but he got him a place on board the ship to go to Cuba with the intention of then bringing us to Cuba. Wild international imaginations at play here. Wild imaginations in wartime, and wild imaginations about what surely must be possible when any good realist will tell you, forget it, it's impossible. So he gets, through a friend of his, always a friend, always a friend, always a connection, always Christian neighbor, former Christian neighbor, always somebody that saves his life and gets him a ticket on board ship of the St. Louis.
And there were only 937 passengers.
Pardon?
There were 937 Jewish passengers, mainly Jewish passengers on this ship.
Many Jewish passengers.
937 who were mainly Jewish.
Yes.
And it left in May 39.
Pardon?
It left from Hamburg in May 39. It left from Hamburg
Right.
in May 39.
Right.
And then did you know that your father was on the ship? Did he write to you, or did you
Oh
have
yes.
any...
Oh no. We did. Oh yes. Oh yes. We were in complete contact.
So you knew he had, and this was
He and
a passage to freedom.
he and my mother decided this is what they're going to do. He's going to try to get on board some ship to Cuba. Once he's in Cuba, he'll bring us to himself.
And then eventually to the States, from Cuba to the States. I
Right.
think that must have been the plan.
Right. Exactly. An impossible notion that almost succeeded. Almost succeeded. Because I think there were a couple of other ships, not the St. Louis, that were not returned. The passengers landed in Cuba.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to those passengers, but I think they succeeded. The whole idea of going to Cuba in order to go to America where you had relatives, I mean, it's mind-boggling. They didn't know anybody in Cuba. They had no contact with people in Cuba. And anything could happen and did happen. So when the St. Louis gets turned back from a Cuban port back into Germany,
Well, it then went from Havana to Miami, and Roosevelt declined to, he would not allow the ship to disembark, and Canada also declined. It's a stain on the conscience of the world. It's a terrible episode. What happened? How?
Yeah, right. But I was very conscious of the hours during which the ship was turned back, and as far as we knew, headed directly back to Germany. That was our reality, not the future that came. So I don't know how my mother managed those moments. I really don't. My own coping strategy, I guess, was to assume the worst isn't going to happen.
The only positive...
But as a child of 11, 12, I knew there was absolutely nothing I could do. And two, I was absolutely convinced it would work out okay. I mean, the most irrational of thoughts. Most irrational of thoughts. I had no evidence whatsoever that everything was going to work out. Quite the opposite. I mean, if you start out with an uncle having been murdered in 1933 by National Socialists, my trust in God to work everything out properly didn't exist. Didn't exist. I was raised as an Orthodox Jewish kid. The platform in Spongine, when we got our father back, killed that fundamental belief. Just killed it. I mean, I had all the proof in the world that accounts for beans. And any 10-year-old with any smarts would have recognized the same thing. I mean, when you so clearly see the father standing next to you with a group of people who had just been deported, and just because some official calls his name, he has to leave us and walk along that long, of course much longer than I thought it was, platform to get his papers back so that he can then with his family be deported out of Germany. It destroys all sense of independence. All sense of independence, except my own. Except my own. Because when that happened, and I think I tried to capture this in a book somewhere, when that happened, I knew perfectly well he had lost complete control over my future.
It was a defining period in your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if Nazi officials can make him walk down that platform, wait for his papers, decide when he can come back, he's lost any autonomy. I didn't have the vocabulary then, but I knew it. I knew it, and I never forgot it to this day.
But good. The positive thing is that the boat didn't return to Hamburg. The St. Louis didn't return to Hamburg. I think the Joint were very instrumental in having the boat dock in Antwerp, and then 4 countries decided they decided to take the Jews.
Right.
England, France,
Yeah.
Belgium, and Holland.
Right.
And I think your father was sent to Holland and he went on a boat to Rotterdam.
Right. Right.
So thank God the boat didn't return to Hamburg or back to Germany.
Right. Right.
But what's sad is from that
Pardon?
St. Louis there were many that didn't survive when they came back to Europe. There were a good number that didn't survive. They went through the camps and they never survived.
Yes, I think that's true. Right.
And then, can you tell us a little bit about your father? Because from there, he went to Westerbork. He was in Holland and he landed up being interned in Westerbork.
You know, I don't know very much about him in Westerbork. I have little bits and pieces. And by the time I put those bits and pieces together, I was already a professional historian. So my whole entire approach to his stay in Westerbork comes as an investigating historian, more so than the son worried about his father. I mean, my professional interest in his life at a certain point took over any sentimental relationship I had to my father, and therefore was very interested in what he was doing.
So we have a picture in your book of your father in 1942 when he was in Westerbork. And this picture is from a photo album in Yad Vashem. When your father was deported to and interned in Westerbork, did you have contact with your father? Could you write to each other? Or did you know what was happening to him in Westerbork?
I think the answer is yes and no to all those questions. Because my mother had an occasional letter. Once he was interned in Holland, and especially after the Germans conquered Holland. Those were two different periods of time. Internment by the Dutch, imprisoned by the Germans, and then liberated by the Allies. My mother had occasional letters through the Red Cross. Occasional, I think maybe one or two. And he, as I learned after the war, and he came to play a pretty important role in life in Westerbork. Absolutely no question. Westerbork wasn't a regular concentration camp. It was set up to handle deportees on the way to Eastern Europe. And he, because of his connections to the early group of people who set up Westerbork, and partly because he was associated by the people in Westerbork with the St. Louis, he acquired a certain kind of special status among the people, Jewish people, who ran Westerbork under Nazi authority. Jews ran Westerbork under the authority of the German government operating in Holland. And before that, Jews were running the camp in Holland under the jurisdiction of the Dutch government.
There was the Judenrat. The Judenrat. There was the Jewish, like the Judenrat. It was they had Jewish officials that were in charge of...
Right. But of course, everybody who participated in that knew exactly where authority lay. I mean, there was a lot of delusion and illusion going on here. At the bottom of the hierarchy, the Jews knew what sphere they governed. And they always knew that their little sphere was in the hands of the German government. But they pretended, I think, that they had some autonomy.
I think this is encapsulated in a person that your father knew very well, Etty Helsum. She have a picture of Etty, and she was very influential. She wrote a book, Letters from Westerbork, and the tragedy. Picture was taken in 1942. The tragedy is that she was sent to Auschwitz, and she died in Auschwitz. And she was very influential.
Well, I came to know a lot about Eddie Hillsum. A lot. And of course, at the time, I didn't know anything about Eddie Hillsum. But after the war, I was already an established historian. I learned a lot about Eddie Hillsum. A lot. There are a few different kinds of Eddie Hillsum. There's the Eddie Hillsum who's the sister and daughter of an entire family in Westerbork. And many of the decisions she made was the daughter and sister of the family. Many of her decisions in Westerbork were made in terms of her sense of family obligation, especially her brother. I think after reading a lot by Eddie Hillsum and about Eddie Hillsum, she learned how to protect Eddie Hillsum and Eddie Hillsum's family, even as she developed into the kind of character who became famous after the war. She and my father became friends. I never really learned what kind of friends. I know she was very important in my father's life in Westerbork. And he, by virtue of his position as a barrack leader and some other things, within the framework in which he lived, had a certain kind of autonomy. I have no idea really how close they became. Surely I have no idea whether they ever became intimate.
Your father never spoke, he never spoke to you or your mother
To my mother, I have no idea. She never talked to me about it. He never talked to me about it either. But I think I've read just about everything that involved her and my father. And I know that he felt very close to Educator. How close, I don't know. But it was more than just, hello, how do you do, in the local grocery store. There was a bond between them. And the bond was shaped from her early days in Westerbork. I think he was in love with Westerbork, with Educator. I think. Or at the least, I think he had some kind of devoted relationship with Educator. And she gave him every reason to have that. I mean, there's few notes that they exchange and stuff like that. Something was there. He didn't manipulate Educator. She probably manipulated my father. In order for her to survive Westerbork the way she did, to try to protect her family the way she tried and failed, I have a great difficulty dealing with Educator as some kind of angelic person who hovers over the spirit of Camp Westerbork. She knew exactly what she was doing when she was doing it. I think she was a remarkable person. Even heroic. But to not recognize how Educator tried very hard to protect her family's needs in these kinds of conditions is absurd.
But she couldn't protect herself. She was eventually sent to Auschwitz.
Exactly. No, she never could.
And can I ask you, how did your father manage to survive? How did that he was never deported?
I have no idea. He, by virtue of having been on the ground floor when Westerbork began, he became Westerbork royalty. I think it's that simple. He became Westerbork royalty. And I think he was a good bureaucrat who managed as best possible the circumstances in which he found. He was no babe in the woods. He attended too many meetings in Westerbork with German officials. So he was a barrack leader. He went to meetings of barrack leaders. It was his way to survive. And it's his way to helping others to survive. But he was part of the system, and he knew it. I think he kept his integrity, and the fact that he had the respect of people who were associated with the Dutch underground and some other people who lived in Westerbork is sort of a kind of testimony to that other side of him. So, in the most simple terms, his room as a barrack leader could become a meeting room, did become a meeting room for some of the individuals in Camp Westerbork who discussed all kinds of things, including rebellion. But it never went anywhere. And in retrospect, I suspect that particular part of his life was part of his adjustment to the reality of conditions of Westerbork. And his relationship to Eddie Hillesum was part of that, is part of that story. Is part of that story. I can't approach Eddie Hillesum with the angelic spirit that a number of people seem to write about. Eddie Hillesum knew exactly what she was doing, with whom, and when.
And Gerd, with your father, when you met your father, after the war, when he came to America, and you were reunited, could you ever ask your father about his experiences in Westerbork, or did he ever open up?
I tried a number of times, but he didn't allow a serious conversation. Went nowhere. He never talked to us about Eddie Hillesum. Not to me. I don't think he ever talked to his wife about her either. And to tell you the truth, I don't think I really have the knowledge to talk about her relationship to my father. Part of me tells me she used my father as long as possible. And part of me tells me that whatever Eddie Hillesum did in the camps, she did in order to survive, in order to help her family to survive. And then there were these other relationships that played around that center. I've never looked at Eddie Hillesum as some angelic figure. And for that matter, I didn't think of Eddie Hillesum as some kind of heroic figure either. And that may be very unfair on my part. But I think there were all kinds of deceptions going on. Yes,
she had given your father some personal letters.
Yes, she did. She did. Oh, there was a relationship there. There was a relationship. And I think it was genuine. I don't know how deeply felt it was. I have no idea.
But these letters were later published. The letters were later published.
Yes. Yes. But you really don't find references to my father in those letters. Maybe some other scholars have now found them, but I don't think you will ever find anything. But I'm a little biased because I think Eddie Hillesum used my father as long as possible. After all, he had the official position in the campus hierarchy, not Eddie Hillesum. He was a barrack leader. She wasn't. And she certainly didn't have the internal connections to the Jewish leadership in Westerbork that he did.
When your father came back to America, when you were reunited, did he reconnect with any other prisoners from Westerbork, any other Jews?
Absolutely, absolutely. He had a whole circle of friends from Westerbork. A whole circle of friends.
Did they used to come to your home? Do you remember meeting?
Yeah, of course. And the most powerful figure in his circle, Jewish circle, was Eric Cohn. Because Eric Cohn came as close as any Jew in Westerbork in his relationship with the governor of Westerbork, the guy who was the Nazi official who ran Westerbork. So I got to know Cohn as a young man. And even as a young man, I couldn't quite understand what the friendship was all about between him and my father. But my father treated him with the utmost of respect. Utmost of respect. In terms of camp context, probably utmost of respect that he gave him within camp life, because Eric Cohn was a very, very shrewd and clever man. And he really knew how to live with the German leadership. He really did. He saved his wife, he saved his dear friends. I think he saved my father's life, and maybe some others. I wish I had written something about Eric Cohn, but I never got around to it. And it wouldn't have been easy to do anyway. But he was a very significant person in Westerbork. Very significant. He doesn't show up in Westerbork accounts that you can easily identify. Maybe someday somebody will do it. But there's no question in my mind that Eric Cohn was one of these relatively few but still many Jews who really, really, really knew how to play the role between the German occupier and the Dutch and Jewish prisoners. No question in my mind.
But Gerd, I just want to ask you, it's so sad that from Westerbork, so many Jews, Dutch Jews, were deported. They're saying over 70% of all Dutch Jews.
Pardon?
They say that the percentage is so high of the Dutch Jewry that were sent and deported to the camps.
Right.
It's over 70% of all Dutch Jewry.
Pardon?
Over 70% of all Dutch Jewry were deported to either Auschwitz or Sobibor or the camps.
Right.
And they passed through Westerbork mainly.
Right. Right.
It was a terrible transit camp. It was
Right. Right.
and there weren't that many survivors.
But right. I once tried very hard to confront exactly the situation that you identify, and I learned to put things into extreme terms. The realistic option for my father, considering what he was doing, how he was doing it, when he was doing it, one realistic option was suicide. There's no other way of dealing with it. And some people did. Quite a number of people committed suicide. And I think among the people who committed suicide were people who recognized that all they were doing in the name of helping fellow Jews was a delusion and an illusion. But that's very harsh, realistic critique, because if you were inside that situation, you saw your actions quite differently than I just described them, because you understood very well from inside that circle that in order to accomplish the best for your fellow Jews, you had to collaborate with the Nazi rulers. And that immediately, from an outsider's perspective, immediately puts you into that much larger group of people in the concentration camp world of National Socialism, where so many individual Jews tried as best they could to serve two masters, to serve Jewish folks and Jewish people, Jewish friends, and not get killed by the Nazis. It's that simple in my mind. It's that simple. And your choices were very clear. It's that simple also. You either committed suicide or you did the next best thing. You volunteered to go on transport. My father, in some of his writings, talks about that exact choice. And he doesn't spell it out, but it doesn't take very much imagination. He is, after all, a father who has a wife and sons. So what do you do in order to stay alive, in order to return to your wife and sons? What do you do? And how much of what you do you have to do in order to bring that ending to life? Or to put it another way, how much, what exactly is it you have to do to remain alive until the end of the war and liberation? What do you have to do? And how much are you willing to do in the name and sake of those ends? And how much of it is self-delusion? Because part of you knows that future doesn't exist. That future doesn't exist. You're making it up. You're making it up. And everything that you're doing is for your present comfort and survival. You justify everything that you're doing to survive in order to rejoin your family. That's the operating principle. You really believe it? I have no idea. My father was a God-fearing man. He came out of Hasidic Jewry. He was also a modern secular man, modern Zionist. I don't know that man. I don't know that man from Westerbork. I really don't. I know that man from before. I know that man after. But every time I try to put together what I do know and what I don't know, I'm left with far more questions than answers.
But thank God he survived. Thank God.
Because he survived, and how he survived, and my luck or maybe it's more than my luck, the reputation he retained among the survivors, the Jewish survivors, was never besmirched by a negative thought.
Which is a major thing. That's a major,
Right.
because there were many that joined and their names were soiled. People
Right.
saw them as collaborators or saw them
Right,
as
right, right.
sellouts or...
Right, right. I mean, he almost always gets continually identified with maintaining a Jewish presence, maintaining Jewish comrades in his cabin, being a visible participant in organized Jewish life in Vesterbork. I think he saved his soul. I think so. I wouldn't go to court over it, but I think so.
So Gerd, I just have to mention, your story is so riveting and what you went through is so unbelievable. And added to this, you and your brother became one of the Kindertransport, which
Right.
is another phenomenal part of Holocaust history, Jewish history. So if you can tell us a little bit about how your mother made that decision to allow you, it must have been one of the hardest decisions for a parent to send their children to a country, to a place where they have no connection and they don't know what the future will hold. It's a very courageous decision to make.
I think there's so many different levels at which to respond to that question. The easiest one for me is to recall the context in which she had to make that decision. And think about others who made similar and much harder decisions. The one thing I think you have to rule out immediately is any sense of heroic consciousness. I don't know about other mothers, but I know in the case of my mother, whatever she did and how she did it and when she did it, she did for her children and husband. I never heard anything from anybody in my life about my mother that runs counter that kind of impression. She had a sense of responsibility and duty to her family members, to her family members, just family memory, but most importantly to her children and husband. She made sure that her children knew all about their father. She never for one moment allowed us to forget him. Never. And whatever she did was in that context. I think, like so many other parents, Kindertransport parents, in her case, maybe a little bit more so, she believed in God. She wasn't necessarily a Shomer Shabbat Shomer Mitzvot, but she certainly was a deep believer. And she knew what her responsibilities were. And she acted on them. So she became a housekeeper for quite a number of years. She worked far away from us. She figured out a way how to board us with strangers and relatives.
But her decision to send you on the kinder transport, you and your brother,
They made it together
They made it together.
with my father. She didn't make that decision alone.
And
She executed it alone. She executed it alone. But they were in touch with each other because Holland was neutral
they could
for quite a
communicate.
number of years. So there was some correspondence with my father.
And what is your recollections of going to when you and your brother were told that you're going on the kinder transport, that you're going to England, and you had to go to Otvark, right next to Warsaw, to catch the train? Do you recall? Do you remember that episode when you left your mother and you?
Yeah.
Can you recount it, because it's historic. It really is historic.
This may surprise you, but I had a child's memory and experience of being sent away from my family into a summer camp in Germany, where I spent 7 or 8 weeks away from the family. I lived in the summer camp. I had done that before I was 10. And I think part of me got some chashara training from that childhood experience. Otherwise, I don't understand why I didn't collapse. I have to be very careful how I express these things, because the opportunity for self-glorification is very high, since I felt completely responsible for my brother.
And you were only 11 at this time.
Completely responsible for him. And so that the high point of that tension of responsibility came when our names were being called out in Poland for going on board ship. I think 6 or 7 names didn't show up. And there was a terrible moment when my name showed up on a list that was going, but my brother's name wasn't right afterwards. It came after a few names. And the celebration between the two of us was, I remember it so vividly.
And can I ask you, do you remember saying goodbye to your mother when you took the train?
Oh, yeah.
When you left, that must have been very difficult to say goodbye to your mother.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But either there or elsewhere, I became a master of suppression. I just suppressed any scared, any feelings that this is impossible. I just suppressed it all.
But you had, at a boy of 11 with your brother,
Pardon?
being only 11 years old, you had to go onto a train by yourselves with your brother,
Right,
and
right.
I think Yosela joined you.
Pardon?
It was you, your brother, and Yosela. I think he was with you as well.
Right,
And you went to a place called Otvok by yourselves,
right.
and then you stayed there till, I think they had to get, they had to, Jewish families in England had to confirm that they would support the kinder transport. That's why it took so long for you. It took a while for the kinder transport to leave, because you had to have the permission of the Jewish families in London.
Oh. But I wasn't privy to any of that. I wasn't privy to any of that. What I was learning along the way was that nothing is permanent. Absolutely nothing. And you had to be prepared for anything. Nothing is permanent, you have to be prepared to anything. My primary responsibility was my brother.
So
I was responsible for my brother.
Now you left very late in August.
Pardon?
You left very late. It was in August 39.
Right.
It was just before September. You left, and I think before you left on the train to go to catch the boat that would take you to England, you had to have your hair shaved for last.
Right.
You recall that incident?
Yeah. But it was part of the routine. Once you were in the process of being shipped with children, that was one of the ordinary things in life. Traumatic, sure, but you knew it was going to happen, and you just did it.
And good. Do you remember the train ride when you went to Warsaw, and they were now mobilizing because they knew that the invasion is imminent? Do you remember going on the train ride from Warsaw to Danzig and then to the port Gdynia where you took the
Yes,
boat?
very clearly. And that's largely because Poland was mobilizing. So when my brother and I and others in our families ended up on the Warsaw railway station, we were all very conscious that war could break out any minute, although we had no idea what war breaking out any minute really meant. We just heard the words, and it was very scary, but didn't really know what it meant. So we were in a kind of automatic response mechanism. The moments in the Warsaw station were really terrifying. Really terrifying. Because on the one hand, my brother and I came to Warsaw with the other children from Odwotsk, and suddenly found ourselves in Poland, in a Polish situation where the military was mobilizing for war. It was all around us. It was all around us. And at the time I was barely aware of some of the dramatic situations that were all around me. For example, I had no idea that Joseph's mother had made her way from Spongin to Warsaw to intercept Joseph, take him out the Kindertransport, and take him back to Spongin. No idea. I learned about it afterwards. I had no idea that that mother, in the Warsaw railway station, where she saw other parents bringing their children to the station in order to get them on our Kindertransport unsuccessfully, was on the verge of pulling Joseph off the transport. And then in the face of the behavior of these other mothers and fathers, she changed her mind and let him stay on transport. And I'm not making up this story. She told it to me after the war and after she survived, in Joseph's and his wife's house in London many years afterward. So the decisions that mothers and fathers and children made in that small space of the Warsaw railway station and in that particular moment in time, they were terrific. They were horrific. Horrific. And they happened so quickly. So quickly.
It must be the most difficult decision to make for any parent to make.
My brother and I didn't have to make the decision, and it was all made for us. But she, Joseph's mother, she made them on the spot. Watching other mothers put their children on the train, and there she is, wanting to take her son off the train, off the transport, and having to decide whether they were right or she was right. And she's an Aguda mother. She's just not an ordinary Jewish mother. She's an Aguda mother.
It's very orthodox.
Ultra-Orthodox. Wig and all.
So here we have a picture. This is before the... This was, I think, you and your brother. Yeah, it's you and your brother on the bottom. And Joseph's in this picture as well. This was before the Kindertransport. It's amazing. So she made the decision, and you were together, in a way you were in charge of your brother and Joseph. You had to be the adult. You had to, you were the guardian.
Yes, that's right, that's right. And I was very conscious of it, because I think I wrote about it in Nightmare's Fairy Tale, but it's still with me. The memories are still with me. It's mundane, it's ordinary, but it's so revealing. We're on board the Warsaw.
But what is your recollections of Danzig?
Pardon?
What do you remember about the city of Danzig? Do you remember?
About?
Danzig.
Danzig, oh. Not much more than I wrote about. I remember very well, very clearly, why Danzig was important and what was happening in Danzig. And being scared as hell that we'll never get through Danzig. Because of all the things that we were hearing about Danzig, we could easily be caught in crossfires and who knows what.
There were many Germans there, many Nazis.
Yeah, the Poles and the Germans. They each threatened to take over this free city. So we were hoping that it remained a free city until we get through it, which fortunately it did.
And going on the boat, you remember the boat was the name of the boat?
Warsaw.
Yeah. And you remember going onto the boat?
Oh yes, for sure. For sure. I think I remember going on the boat, I remember going off the boat, I remember a lot of things about the boat. And I was trying to tell you a minute ago, Joseph and Manny and I bonded the first meal we had on the Warsaw because we were served eggs, mountains of eggs. I still see them. I still see them. And so we eat egg number 1, we eat egg number 2, and then Joseph takes the third egg and I tell him, no way. You're not allowed to eat more than 2 eggs. And with that, suddenly you had 3 brothers. Absolutely 3 brothers whose heart was broken when we had to leave him in London, in England.
Yeah. And when you got to Southampton,
Pardon?
you get to Southampton, and the date is, you arrived in August the 29th. It's incredible that you arrived literally just before the outbreak of when Germany invaded Poland.
Right.
August the 29th.
Pardon?
You arrived on August the 29th in England.
Yeah.
It's if it would have been delayed a few more days, you wouldn't have made it.
Yeah, right. So what's new?
That's incredible. And there were some of the children that they didn't have Jewish homes in London and they weren't on the list and they didn't make the kinder transport.
Right.
Which is also a very sad part of our history as well.
Right. Well, the most dramatic moment was in Odvodsk, when some children were not on the list.
Yeah.
That's when the worst happened. To realize some children were going to be left behind.
It must have been so difficult, so traumatic.
But we couldn't do anything about it. One of the things I learned, at least very early on, how commonplace my situation was of having to accept helplessness. That you just were not in control. I mean, a 10-year-old thinks he's in control of everything. And you suddenly have to recognize you're not in control of anything. And I used to tell myself, well, all 10-year-olds have that experience. All 11-year-olds have those experiences. Just different circumstances. But I don't think that's the case. I think the demands that adults placed on us children were so outrageous, that it's a miracle we didn't collapse under the pressure.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Good. You arrive in London, and then you're taken to Jewish families.
Right.
And it was the three of you as a unit.
5 of us.
There were two Jewish girls as well.
Yeah.
That's Paula and Frida.
Yeah.
So the 5 of you taken to, you're right, to a Jewish family.
Right.
And I think you were near Hyde Park.
They had a big apartment.
It was in the middle of London. It's
Pardon?
I think you were near Hyde Park, in the middle of London.
Yeah, right. Right.
And they were good to you, the family that took you in?
Pardon?
The Jewish family that took you in, they were good to you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But they didn't have us for very long.
Because the war broke out.
Yeah, right. So we were we turned from refugees to evacuees.
So I think you went to the Jewish free school.
Pardon?
You went to the Jewish free school.
Right.
And then those children from the Jewish free school had to be evacuated.
Right.
And you were all sent to a town in Devon, Tarleton in Devon.
Right.
So what is your recollections of going to Devon? What do you remember when you arrived there? And
By that time, everything was part of an adventure. I mean, every moment was new. Every other person we met was a stranger. And I don't quite know, or I don't remember how I arrived at the conclusion, and then what I did with that conclusion, namely, my position as older brother and caretaker now of Joseph how are we going to manage a Christian world? We came out of a Jewish world. How do you live with Christians? How do you do that? How do you trust them? This is after all 1939-40. How do you do it? One step at a time for sure, but it's sort of a black umbrella hanging over your head. Fortunately for us, the people that were involved were angels.
it was Polly and Ruth Gosling.
Hmm?
Polly and Ruth Gosling.
Exhausting.
Polly and Ruth Gosling.
Gosling, yes.
They decided to take you and
Right.
and Yossel.
Right, yeah, I mean, good Anglicans, anti-Semitic neighbors, anti-Jewish neighbors, wanting to do the right thing as Christians for Jews under the circumstances, connected with relatives and friends who were in the business of converting Jews to Christians. All the circumstances designed to destroy your past. They were all in front of us. All in front of us. And in retrospect, there were some reasons why we won and they lost. Because we were with a Jewish group connected to a Jewish community related to a Jewish teacher in Gallatin for the first months of the war, right? But then all the others left. They went home.
Or the evacuees, the non-refugees, they went back home.
They went back home to London to face the Blitz. And Joseph and I and the three girls, we were left alone in Gallatin.
It was Paul and Frida, yeah.
Right.
But you organized a Seder.
Yeah, right.
And you took the Seder. You did the Seder?
Right. I mean, it's a tribute to the Goslings, not to me. It's really a tribute to the Goslings that they facilitated all my efforts to retain a Jewish connection. Joseph and the girls were much younger than I was. Much younger, 3 years older. And I'd been raised as a Zionist who was observant enough to pay attention to the Chagim. Shabbat wasn't any, lost its importance. But there were certain elements of the bonds of the past which were just a given. I mean, just couldn't do without them. So, I guess as the oldest, I then took responsibility for making sure that we commemorated Pesach. That's no mean feat.
It's a major achievement.
No
that you
mean
did.
feat.
And I think they respected your decision not to eat meat. You never ate the meat. I think the Goslings respected your decision not to have
until the
meat.
very end. I don't know why we finally gave in, but right.
And did you have any communication with the Jewish community in London? Did they send anyone to come and visit you, or?
Not that I remember, no. Not that I remember. Our connection was with our teacher. I forgot his first name. Korman, yeah. He tried very hard to facilitate. And it's so satisfying and so amazing that this cone, this same very cone, ends up in Europe in the refugee camp, displaced persons camp, that's housing Joseph's mother and sister. And his presence, Cohn's presence at the meal that they ate together, where the mother showed her picture. Because she knew her son was in England somewhere, but she didn't know where. Brought the house down, so to speak.
So you have a lovely picture in your book of yourself and Manfred and Yossel in 1940. And look, they took good care of you. You look well dressed and
Right.
and happy, smiling. Good, it is. It's remarkable how you survived and how you never gave up, how you continued. But you had communication with your mother and your father. You could write letters in the beginning.
Before the war broke out, we did. And we were reunited with my mother in 1940. That was almost immediately, relatively speaking.
How long did you spend in Devon?
Pardon?
How long did you spend in Devon with the Gosslers?
Well, we got to Devon in August 1939.
I think
And I think we
September.
left Devon in September of the following year.
So you were a year. You were literally like a year there.
It was a year. It was about a year. And we left to sail with a 3-day aircraft convoy. And then the ship went by itself.
But I think your mother's brother, he had emigrated to England in '39, Sally, and he came to see you in Devon, and here's a picture. And I think he was very instrumental in organizing.
Absolutely.
Because you had no papers, you were stateless.
Absolutely.
But you had to go by yourself. You had to go to the consulates by yourself to get the papers.
Right.
And then here is a certificate, identity certificate that you managed to obtain. Gerd Korman. It's incredible. And Sally, you had a good connection. You were close with him. He had a good connection with your uncle, with your mother's brother.
Absolutely.
He was with the British uniform. And when he organized that you would go on the boat, when you got the documents that you could come, and because your mother she went back to Germany and then from Poland, and she managed to get through the neighbor, through Christian Gessler, she managed to get a passage to New York.
Somebody's busy.
The planes flying about.
I haven't heard this before. Not like this.
Does this bring back recollections of when you were in London, when there was a blackout and a bit of a blitz? I don't know that you witnessed, but your mother actually managed to get to America.
Pardon?
Your mother managed to get documents, and she managed to leave Germany. She was very fortunate that she went by herself.
Right.
But she was in communication with your father.
Right.
And she came there with very little money, with virtually penniless. Your mother, when she arrived in America, she didn't have much.
No, she worked.
She worked. When you had to leave the Goslars and when you had to say goodbye to Yosela, it must have been very traumatic because you had developed this closeness.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Because no, because I knew what Manfred and I had to do. There was never a question in my mind of not leaving Charlton. Never. There was always the connection to my mother and to reach my mother, to go to my mother. And the Goslings knew it. And so long as there was an active connection with my mother, there was the active connection with my mother. And then, I mean, in retrospect, I don't quite know how that really worked. But we were children, right? And my connections to Joseph became very similar to my connections to my brother. And yet they remained very different. Very different. I had no emotional problems leaving Joseph. I was going to my mother with my brother. And Joseph couldn't come with us, and that was the end of it. Period. Full stop. Exclamation point. In retrospect,
But leaving Joseph, it must have been difficult to say goodbye
to Joseph.
to Joseph.
Well, I'm trying to share that moment with you. It was and it wasn't. Once it was clear to me, I've got to be very careful because these kinds of conversations make the self-serving explanation very attractive and much too easy.
It's true.
But the bond with Joseph, at one level, superficially speaking, was a brother. But I knew he had a sister somewhere in Palestine. And there's somewhere he had a mother. And I knew there were relatives in England. So I knew Joseph would be okay. That's at one level. At another level, and I don't know if the word level is the right word, but at another level, we had become very close. Very, very close. And as in many situations that I was in, or at least as I remember having been in, I knew there's nothing I could do about it. I didn't have the option of saying no to my mother.
Yeah.
And I had no way of bringing Joseph with us. I learned very quickly that he thought we had abandoned him. And he was right. He was right. At the point we were together in England, he had no reason to expect his family to remain alive. That's a fact of the matter. He hoped they would. We were in touch, etc., etc., etc. But we all knew enough to know they could all disappear.
But Gerd, what's so sad is that the two sisters, Frida and Paula, they unfortunately didn't have family that could come in and rescue them.
I was never close to those two sisters. And I suspect it was one of the reasons because their household, their Christian household, moved very quickly to convert them.
That's a tragedy. That is such a tragedy. And they were converted.
Yeah,
they were baptized and they were converted.
By 1945 they were converted. But they were converted only after, I think, they forced the English family that they were with understood that their parents were dead.
Now, Gerd, I have to ask you a very difficult question. And this begs the question, why did the Jewish community, why did they not help? Maybe bring them back to London or put them in a Jewish family? Because by the inaction, it caused these two girls to lose their faith. And that's not what the parents initially had intended when they sent them on the kinder transport. It's a very difficult question.
I've thought a lot about this issue. A lot. And at a certain point in my life, I became a father and a husband with 4 of my own children. And I came to appreciate what's truly involved in opening your home to a stranger and making that stranger part of your family. I realized very early on in my life how easy it is to have expectations for the other to do the right thing when in fact you know you probably can't do it yourself.
So true.
And I think English Jewry and its committees and its leadership probably did as best as they could. But it wasn't enough. And yet the minute I say that, the minute you put on the table the expectation in a realistic manner, the other option is much too powerful, much too powerful. You allow a child into your family, a complete stranger, you allow it into your family, and now suddenly you have to share everything that you planned for your own children for this stranger. How do you do that? The fact that some people did it is magnificent. But how do you do that? And most people couldn't do it, or wouldn't do it. And I think if somebody tells you that they could and would, that's bullshit.
It's looking from the other side, and it's true. You're right. It's so true.
So when you read these discussions by clerics, Jewish clerics, or Jewish people running agencies and committees, and you read about the negligence, what I was always struck with was the ordinariness of the negligence. How ordinary it was to forget about those kids. How ordinary it was to just let them be. How long do I have to worry about World War II refugee children and their well-being in my neighborhood or my England? How long? How long? And for whom? And why me? Why not the neighbor? And look at all the money it's going to cost me. And look at all the emotions it's going to claim on me. Much easier to bypass it. Much too busy. Somebody else is just a man and wife. Let them take care of it.
But good. Look at the consequences. These two girls lost their Jewish identity and their Jewish faith.
Right.
And I think years later you actually met.
Pardon?
Years later you actually met one of the sisters. Many years later you actually met. Many years later you came back to England and you met one of the sisters.
Say again?
Many years later you came back to England and you actually met. You went to the town and you met one of the sisters.
Right.
Yeah. And you met Yosela many years later, and you also the Goslars. Many years later you came.
Right. Right. Well, I recognized very early that the Goslings were very special. Very special. I mean, here are two Anglican women who take care of these Jewish kids, make no effort whatsoever to convert them. Nothing. Take them to church every once in a while, but that's only to make them part of the family. Never. I don't know how many Goslings there are, but they were angelic. Just angelic. I owe them everything. I certainly owe them my appreciation for what's potentially possible among Christian families towards Jews. And even though I also know they have friends and maybe even relatives who are very gung-ho in converting Jews, and there's always the possibility that even among the two Gosling women, ultimately conversion was a dream come true. They kept it at a distance. They held it off, I think. Or they understood what they couldn't do. I mean, they really related to the temporariness of the situation that the war was imposing on them. And unlike their neighbors, or some of their neighbors, they didn't take any steps, not one, to pull us in their direction. Not a single step.
And good. Many years later, I think your mother met with the Goslings.
Yes.
To show her appreciation.
Oh. And how?
Yeah.
And how? My mother By the time my mother did this, my father had returned from the camps. But we had no money in New York. And from somewhere, somehow, my mother found the money of going to England, visiting Ruth Gosling, and taking her to the beach. I mean, my mother knew what she was grateful for. She knew. Because she knew exactly what the Goslings had done. The Goslings never once explicitly touched our Jewish commitments. We went to church with them every once in a while. We celebrated Christmas with them. But for the year at least, it never crossed the line. It never crossed the line.
It's amazing. It really is. It's remarkable.
Absolutely. And the hospitality Ruth Gosling showed my mother. You know, when my mother felt so obligated to come visit her, this was my mother's idea, nobody else's idea. And she was not a rich woman to find airplane ticket money. But she made it her business to make sure she met Ruth Gosling to say thank you personally.
It's incredible.
Yes, it is incredible.
So I just want to ask you, when you found out the news that you're going to be reunited with your mother,
Pardon?
when your Uncle Sally came with the news that there's a possibility that you're going to be taking a ship to America and being reunited with your mother, it must have been also you must have been very grateful and very happy that you're going to now be reunited with your mother.
I don't understand the question.
You're going to, when your uncle gave the news that he's arranged that you're going to be reunited with your mother, you and your brother, that you were going to take the ship.
Oh, yes.
So can you take us on to going onto the ship and the voyage? Do you recall?
I have to go backwards because I think the answer to that question lies in what happened from the time we got off the ship to be embraced by my mother in New York, at a New York harbor, and going with her on the subway, and changing at Canal Street, and dropping my boxes full of clothing, and then ending up not living with her, living with strangers, and realizing what my mother had done and what she asked to do. It was very touching and overwhelming and disappointing all at one time.
But the ship that you went on, do you remember the ship? I think it was called the Camerona?
Yes.
Was it an adventure, or did you feel...
Yes. No, an adventure.
But you got seasick on that ship as well.
Pardon?
You got seasick.
Yes. Yeah, but it was an adventure. From beginning to end, it was an adventure. And if it wasn't made an adventure, then I turned it into an adventure.
But to think you were only 12 years old at the time,
right.
and your brother was 3 years younger than you, 3.5
right.
years. Two little boys going halfway around the world.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
No.
It's very courageous.
No. No, it was an ordinary response of two children coming to their mother.
But the other...
And they were being naughty.
Did you realize that there, or was it known that there were U-boats, that you were in German infested waters, that many ships had been sunk by the German U-boats, that it was a dangerous voyage?
Oh, absolutely. At the time, oh, absolutely.
It really was a dangerous voyage. There were ships that were...
No. I mean, but we were on an English boat with English sailors who knew they could get torpedoed any minute. So the context in which we were conscious of our situation was a general collective consciousness. Everybody on board that ship knew a torpedo could hit any time. And while we really didn't know what the hell that meant, we certainly didn't think it was going to become a tea party. So it was scary and adventurous both at the same time.
And when you eventually arrived in America...
I think I felt the loneliness of our position and the dangerousness of our position most sharply when I realized one day that on board that ship leaving Scotland, we had a single RAF plane running cover for us for 3 days. I think I got that right, for 3 days. In other words, we must have been within flying distance of airports where they could keep an eye on us with one plane. And then after 3 days, there was no cover. We were in the open sea, and if a German U-boat happened to find us, we'd get sunk. Was that complicated and that easy?
And I think eventually that boat was sunk.
I think afterwards,
On another
it was
boat.
damaged, something or other. Yeah.
And what is your recollections when you came to America? I think you saw the Statue of Liberty and...
Yeah, all the right experiences. But in my mind, they're totally overwhelmed by coming back to my mother when we left the ship.
And it must have been the most emotional moment when you and your brother
Absolutely.
met your mother again.
Absolutely. But something about me, I guess, is quite revealing. Instead of breaking down into tears or joyous laughter...
You sang a song. You sang a song.
I sang my song.
Can you sing it? Do you remember the words?
I don't remember it really. Lustig ist das Zigeunerleben. Meaning, happy is the life of a gypsy. Never forget it. The accuracy of that identification for the rest of my life. I mean, I was always partially a gypsy.
You were always wondering and always, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But the connection with your mother was instant.
Pardon?
You developed a very strong reconnection with your mother.
In English, did you say?
A reconnection with your mother.
Right.
It was an instant reconnection.
An intense connection. In German, was a German language connection. Yeah, I mean, it was... And I must say, to my credit, I had complete appreciation what she was trying to do.
But
In other words, I could have held her with a bad memory for having boarded us out in order to hold a job. But
she wanted you to be in a Jewish environment, in a Jewish environment.
I understood exactly what she was doing and why.
And here's a picture in 1943 with your mother and your brother and you. And look, you in suits. You remember your brother's bar mitzvah? Did you have a bar mitzvah?
Oh, and how? And how? And how? I was a model bar mitzvah student in a congregation in Brooklyn. And they tried to milk it for every dollar to the synagogue where it was being held.
Do you remember the name of the synagogue?
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure.
What was it
Among
called?
the reasons why I remember it so well is I felt so lonely in the synagogue. We didn't have any seats. We had to sit where there happened to be a space. I could go on and on and on with all the symbols and emotions of refugee life and refugee status.
What was the name of the synagogue?
The Glenmore Shul. I don't remember the Hebrew name. Glenmore.
And it was a joyous occasion, the bar mitzvah. It must have been
A joyous occasion? It was mixed.
because your father wasn't there.
Right. Right. And one of the reasons that was mixed is because I knew for whom the bar mitzvah was being held. It wasn't for me, it was for the shul. They used it as a fundraiser.
Well, it's not easy and good having been reunited with your mother, and now you're having to be,
Pardon?
you know, after you met your mother from the boat, and she was staying in an area that wasn't very Jewish or religious, and then you had to be boarded out to other homes again.
Right.
It's not a simple thing. It must have been very difficult for you and your brother.
Yes, it was.
And also not know, well, you knew English, but
Right.
you were in a strange country again,
Absolutely.
and going to school.
Going to school was another matter. No, that was another big matter. That went reasonably well because we spoke English. And so that as I remember, the only major characteristic that distinguished us was that when we first came, we had hobnails in our boots.
And good, do you remember the schools that you went to, when you first came to America?
Yes. Yes. PS 76. Public school number 76 in East New York, Brooklyn.
And I
You
think
keep asking him if he remembers. He
he
remembers
remembers
everything.
I know, it's incredible.
He remembers everything.
I think your mother wanted you to go to a more frum school, but it didn't, to a Talmud Torah, but it didn't work out.
It was terrible.
I didn't understand what you were saying.
I think your mother wanted you to go to a more religious school, to a frum school.
Oh yes, oh yeah, I think I read about
You
it.
do?
Yeah,
But you were happy in the public school,
very,
and you made friends easily.
very. Yes, I did. Good friends, right. No problem. Except I had this real consciousness of being a refugee.
And about being Jewish, was that an issue?
Pardon?
Being Jewish in a public school, was that ever an issue?
Not particularly, no.
In America,
other,
that was different.
other Jewish kids were being Jewish in the public school, but we were among the few who kept Shabbat and kept the Chagim.
And can I ask you, during this time, did you know what was going on in Europe? With the Shoah, what was happening to the Jews in...
Right.
Did you know what was happening?
Yes.
Because many people say that
Yes.
they didn't know till only after the war.
Yes. No. I knew what was happening during the war, and then became a student of the Shoah. One of the early students of the Shoah.
You were the pioneer.
About among American historians, I was really one of the early ones.
And I think your mother
Not one of the great ones, just one of the
I
early
think you were
ones.
possibly the greatest. But good, I want to just mention your mother had a connection with Einstein, with Albert Einstein.
Say again?
Your mother had a connection with Albert Einstein, and she
Yes,
tried to
by
organize.
mail. Yes,
She tried to organize a visa
Yes.
for your father.
yes,
That's incredible.
yes. He was very kind.
Did you meet him?
No, but I had a good friend with whom I played soccer, who lived in a house that had a good friend of Einstein. So when Herbie Scheinholz took me into his apartment to meet his father, he explained to me that on another floor was a friend of Einstein.
And then eventually you moved into Miller Avenue. Eventually you moved into Miller Avenue.
Right.
And you have a picture of the home. And when your father came back, when your father returned, how was the interaction when you saw your father again? Because you had been separated for so many years. It's not an easy question.
No, it's not a difficult question at all. It's not a difficult question at all, because I was already a teenager by then. And I had made a personal commitment on my own, personal commitment. I would become my father's son. So, if he wanted me to change my hairstyle, I changed my hairstyle as a teenager. And so on and so forth.
And you did. He told you to...
I did.
But your parents were they were happily married?
I think so. I'm sure it was very difficult. So I don't know. If a husband is in a concentration camp from 1939, 40 to 45, etc., I have no idea.
Here's a lovely picture of you and your father in 1951. And your father managed to eventually find work?
Yes, he did. It was hard for him because initially he got into jobs for which his physical makeup was not prepared. So he had to leave that particular job and then had to leave another job, and finally found his way back to becoming the salesman that he had been in Germany, and found a wonderful employer. And
then eventually you went on to...
Brooklyn College, right.
Here's a lovely... Can you show us in the picture where you are? This is a lovely picture in Brooklyn College. You were always a good sportsman.
Yeah. This guy was the best player on the team. This is his brother. They were the Mahler brothers. His father was an Olympic soccer player. I think I was number 2.
Good. What made you interested in pursuing a career in the arts, in history and American history in particular?
I think it was very mundane. Somewhere along the way, I developed a liking for history, and I thought I was becoming a high school teacher.
Your brother became a high school
Principal.
A principal, yeah.
I thought I would become a high school teacher. And I went, at Brooklyn College, I went through all courses for high school teaching. Initially, it never occurred to me I'd become a professor at the university. And then one thing led to another. I went to Brooklyn College and I had wonderful teachers, and they kind of opened the door to the possibility that I become a professional historian. Yeah. It was very hard work, very hard, because my family needed me, and I worked while I went to the day session. I started out at night school at Brooklyn College for 1 year. And then my father insisted that I switch to the day session. He helped me make all the right choices.
And your decision to go to college and then to become a professor, when in that journey you must have met so many amazing historians and you must have had incredible professors as well, and teachers.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I've been very fortunate. Very fortunate.
Gerd, I want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. There are no words, really, no words to express my sincere and deep appreciation. You know, I think you must be one of the premier historian. Not only are you a historian, but you lived through it. You are eyewitness to the history. And to be the pioneer in... I think something's going on. I'm going to start it again. Okay. So I just want to thank you again. So important is okay. So good. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's been the greatest honor and privilege being with you, and you relating the most, I don't know, there's no words to explain. It's just been, there are no words. You are our witness to our history, and what you've gone through showcases, and it's not only were you the pioneer in bringing Holocaust to American academia, but you lived it. You are our witness of the history. You are a living example of the history, and the way you related, I'm lost for words. But it's been such an honor and a privilege to be here.
Right.
And I am so eternally grateful to you. And I think you are not only an example we can all strive to emulate, but you are remarkable. And I think your parents were also remarkable. They were heroes. And you and your brother, the connection that you and your brother had is something, it's just spectacular.
Right.
So if I can ask you, I just want to mention that you, including in the various books that you've written, You were also you did the book The Hunter and the Hunted, and you have Elie Wiesel in the book and Simon Wiesenthal. You have the greats in Jewish history that contributed to your book.
Right.
But you yourself, I think, not only were you a pioneer, but you are, I think, one of the most amazing, not only professors, but authors, but your story is one of the most amazing stories of the Shoah. It really is. So if I could ask you, what message do you give? Do you relate to your children and your grandchildren? What message do you give to the future generations? Because you've seen so much in your life.
At 96, I don't think I have a message. I have wonderful children, wonderful friends, teachers, and I'd leave the future to them.
So I want to thank you so much.
But you can come back again. He's got many more wonderful
I am
stories.
so incredibly grateful. And Alana, thank you very much as well.
No. Daddy was a very beloved professor, and he did many things with students. He didn't talk about anything here, but he did many, many things with students. But this student was one of the star students at the ILR school where Daddy was a professor, and he was asked to identify his most favorite professor and why. And so this was the ceremony where Daddy was honored.
Wow.
You'll
Thank you
excuse me.
so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There. So thank you. That's Daddy.